Hello YouTube, just another video on this composition. You can see that a little bit of progress has been made, but this is where it starts to get very time consuming because now I'm rendering the drawing and I've got to render all of those shades and shadows, and this really is just a matter of endurance at this point. Everything on the drawing is pretty much mapped in there, all the characters are in. I'm probably going to draw some more characters here, but right now I really want to focus on getting the tones in there. And you can see how I've started rendering the characters here, and the characters on this side have not been rendered. I've put the base tones in very lightly, as you can see, all across the composition, but now that I'm getting into the more nitty-gritty detail, I've decided to sort of focus on this portion of the drawing here. So why am I doing that? Because, you know, earlier on in the drawing, the whole strategy was to work on the drawing as a whole. And usually you keep with that line of thought. But now I'm sort of working on a more fragmentary scale, right? So I'm working on a small section of the drawing. So I kind of switched tactics a little bit. And the reason I've done that is so that I can see how all these different tones relate to each other, and how they all sort of interact with each other, which again will inform the larger drawing. But it's much easier to sort of focus on a zoomed in part of the drawing instead of constantly, you know, jumping around the drawing everywhere. Because, you know, for example, if I render this guy on this side, and then I jump over to one of these guys, it gets pretty difficult actually to keep on top of how everything's sort of relating to each other, because, you know, I would have to keep standing far away from the drawing to see how all those tones are developing. Whereas now, I mean, I've got a solid enough foundation where I can actually just focus on a very small portion of the drawing, still rendering multiple characters at a time, but this time just on a smaller scale. And that way I don't have to keep stepping far away, you know, from the drawing. I can actually just, you know, stand here and see, okay, yeah, this is good. I like the dark tones here. I like that shadow there. I like the tone here, you know, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, I've kind of switched strategies now, and I'm going to be working on a bit of a smaller scale. Another reason I've chosen to render these guys is because they are in the foreground, okay? All these characters are the ones that are closest to the viewer. So as a result of that, the viewer is likely to notice them first. So I'm basically rendering the tones, which will have the most contrast, right? Because remember that in perspective, shadows get darker and the lights get brighter in the foreground, okay? So there's more contrast in the foreground. And then as, you know, the image travels away, there will be less contrast. Everything will kind of fade out. So the shadows will get brighter and the lights will get a little bit darker in the background there. So by focusing on the characters on the foreground first and getting those darker tones in there on this section of the page, basically what I'm doing is I'm kind of establishing a value range, and then anything that travels far away has to be kept within that value range. And well, it has to occupy a smaller value range, really. So, and another reason I'm rendering these guys first is because of the amount of detail, okay? Because they're right there, they're going to be very detailed. So if I can get that done first, then the rest of the drawing is going to be a piece of cake. But this is time consuming now. This is, like I said, this is a game of endurance now. It's just patience, not forcing it. If I ever feel too exhausted to carry on drawing, I just walk away, you know? I just put the pencil down, take a break, do something else, come back to it refreshed. I think the worst thing you can do is to keep going when you're too exhausted to think. Because drawing is a thinking game, all right? You have to think about perspective and the tones, you know, the reflections of the armor, the anatomy that you have to render. Like there's a lot to think about in an image like this. So you need to make sure that your brain stays fresh throughout the entire process, because if you're gonna just, if you're picking up that pencil and your brain isn't working because you're just too fatigued, that's when you're very likely to make mistakes. And I think a lot of people do make mistakes in their artwork. And I mean, I make plenty of mistakes. That's how you learn. But really, the goal is to kind of minimize as many of those mistakes as you possibly can. So right now, I'm just focusing on, I'm just kind of like rendering the staff on here as well. So that's a pretty easy thing for me to do, right? Because all I got to do is understand that this pole is just a very tall, narrow cylinder. So I'm rendering it where it's a little bit more shaded. There's like a highlight that sort of cuts down the center of it, and then it's a little more shaded on this edge. So that's a pretty easy thing to render. And I would recommend that's how you approach a detailed drawing like this, okay? Just pick one part of the drawing, because there is a lot to draw, but just choose one part, whether it's a helmet or a shield, maybe it's this guy's leg. Just choose one thing and focus all of your attention on that, okay? Just on that specific part. And then that way, you're gonna do a good job. Whereas, again, if you're constantly jumping around all over the drawing, trying to get as much detail in as quickly as possible, I feel like you're kind of spreading yourself a bit too thin. And again, it's probably not gonna turn out as good as you want it to. So have a look at the drawing and just decide, okay, what do I feel like doing now? I think I might move on to this guy's shield here, because that looks like it's gonna be a bit of fun to draw. So once I've just finished drawing the bottom of that, I'm gonna move onto that part. And then, I can see I've rendered the guy's tunic, which I will, I'll fix that up a bit more. But, because I've already drawn that one, then I can move on to this one, which is gonna be easier because I've already done it once. So doing it again is gonna be no problem. So just pick certain parts and focus all of your attention on that part. I feel like that way you're gonna get a much nicer result.